The wind had been relentless all week, turning the Montana forests into an icy barricade that even the brightest sun could not breach. Dorothy Miller, 73 and alone, moved through her small home, its wooden walls creaking against the cold. She paused beside the frosted window and gazed into the hush of morning. The expanse of snow wasn't new to her. This corner of the North had shaped her life, made her wary of its unpredictable heart. Her bones felt the tug of winter, a weight heavier each year. She boiled water for tea, her hands deft from decades of repetition. Outside, the woods pressed closer these days. Groaning evergreens threatened to bow under the snow, and the smaller birds had vanished in recent weeks. Dorothy's rituals had become soliloquies, feeding the chickens, repairing a cracked shovel handle, stacking firewood, all in silence, with no voice but her own for company. In the evenings, she traced old memories, remembering a nephew who called at holidays, children she lost to distance and illness. The old photographs lining her mantle seemed from another lifetime. On this morning, something unsettled her routine. Bruno, her ancient black Labrador mix, whined by the back door. Dorothy watched his anxious tail and felt unease coil inside her. After breakfast, she bundled in her thick coat and stepped into the biting cold. Instantly, she noticed the tracks. Several sharp impressions, not quite canine, not quite anything she recognized, zigzagged from the tree line toward the porch. Bruno sniffed them and whimpered. Dorothy crouched close, studying the prints. Something heavy claws splayed, not a deer or coyote. She followed the trail a few paces, but the rest had been erased by wind and shifting snow. Returning to the porch, Dorothy checked her feed shed. The latch was untouched, but the unease grew. Her chickens clucked nervously, crowded together in one corner. All small signals she had learned to respect in her decades here. As noon faded into afternoon, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling. Her house, warm and quiet, felt different somehow. The wind moaned in the chimney and the trees creaked. The kind of day that made her brood over the fragile piece her life had become. She made soup that evening, the aroma swirling around the worn kitchen. But Bruno was restless, and Dorothy, sitting by the fire with a well-worn book, cast anxious glances toward the window and the forest beyond. Tonight, the silence wasn't comforting. It was tense, the hush before something unknown. By bedtime, Dorothy locked both doors and kept the porch light on, a precaution she hadn't taken in years. She lay awake, listening to Bruno's muffled barks and the distant snap of frozen branches. She didn't know what waited outside, but she sensed her world was shifting and nothing would return unchanged. The following morning, Dorothy's first sight was not the pale glow of dawn, but Bruno barking furiously at the front door. She slipped into boots and flung it open, the cold biting her cheeks instantly. Outside, the world was still, snow blanketing everything in soft curves. And there, in the half-shadow of her porch, lay a wolf, a mother, gaunt and trembling, her side stained by a raw, crusted wound. Dorothy stood frozen. The wolf's eyes were glassy, desperate, and three small pups huddled close to her flank, their ribs showing beneath dirty fur. Bruno barked and backed away. The wolf remained motionless, watching Dorothy with an unblinking stare. Dorothy's first instinct was fear. The wolf, weak as she was, could be dangerous, and the pups even more unpredictable. "Go on," she murmured, waving a broom at the animals. She retreated inside, her heart racing, but they didn't leave. Throughout the morning, Dorothy watched from behind the safety of a curtain as the wolf, barely standing, shifted closer to the porch edge for shelter. The pups whined, licking at their mother's wound and wriggling against her for warmth. Dorothy's chores fell away. She could only return to the window, compelled by unease and curiosity. The wolf was unlike anything Dorothy had seen before. Her wound, a deep gash along the flank, oozed faintly. The pups, smaller than Bruno had ever been, nudged her and yipped. Dorothy made nervous calls to neighbors, asking if anyone had seen strange animals near the woods. Most advised her to call animal control, but Dorothy hesitated. By late afternoon, Dorothy filled a tin bowl with leftover stew and, trembling, placed it on the porch. The wolf raised her head, sniffed tentatively, but wouldn't move while Dorothy stood watching. Only after Dorothy retreated inside did the wolf inch forward and devour the food. The pups followed, lapping at remnants. For Dorothy, the day ended in a tangle of nerves. Why hadn't the wolf run from human scent? Why approach a house at all? Fear lingered with her, but behind it, the smallest trace of compassion surfaced. She recognized despair in the animal's eyes, a look not unlike her own on lonely nights. That evening, as darkness spilled across the porch, Dorothy found herself hoping the wolf would find the strength to move on. But as the hours lengthened, the mother and her pups stayed, their fate woven ever closer to the heart of winter and Dorothy's uncertain future. The wolf family remained near the porch through the next day. Dorothy was restless, torn between the risks and growing pity. Bruno whined constantly, unsettled by the unfamiliar scent and sight. Dorothy spent her morning watching the animals from inside, noticing the subtle ways the mother guarded her pups, curling around them, nudging them to eat, licking their faces with rough tenderness. Dorothy's own memories surfaced as she watched. Years before, she had cradled her children through similar winter nights, sleepless with worry. Her heart ached with the recollection of loss and the relentless task of guiding young through a world full of threat. Neighbors began noticing the wolf tracks. One stopped by late morning, expressing his concern about wild predators lurking so close to civilization. Dorothy assured him she would call animal control, though she hadn't yet found the resolve. In town, people started whispering about danger, but Dorothy felt unease at the thought of handing the wolves over to uncertain fate. On the third afternoon, Dorothy left another bowl of food on the porch, this time stepping further back. The wolf mother, sensing the change, allowed the pups to feed first, only eating when they finished. Dorothy watched how the mother, despite her own pain, pushed her pups forward, unwavering in her devotion. Dorothy scribbled notes in her old journal, details of the wolves' behaviors, changes in their movements, the similarities to her own experience as a mother. The world beyond her home grew tense with rumors and warnings, but Dorothy couldn't abandon the small, battered family at her doorstep. Night closed in with a deep cold, settling over the woods like a shroud. Dorothy found herself whispering prayers for the wolf's recovery, hoping each day she wouldn't have to choose between safety and compassion. As she drifted into sleep, the trust between the wild and the old woman was fragile, forming in small gestures and moments of mercy. Dorothy awoke before sunrise, her thoughts tangled in concern for the wolf and her pups. The previous days had clarified the severity of the mother's wound. Dorothy could see the way the animal limped, the once subtle redness now replaced by crusted blood, her breathing shallow and labored. The pups pressed tightly against their mother, shivering from cold and fear. Dorothy's morning routine, feeding the chickens, checking firewood, became secondary to watching the drama play out on her porch. She knew bandages and medicine were unlikely to be accepted by a wild animal. Still, Dorothy prepared a bowl of warm water and found clean cloth, moving slowly and without speaking. Bruno remained inside, his nose pressed to the door, while Dorothy inched toward the wolf. She crouched, extending the bowl, For a minute, nobody moved. A silent negotiation unfolded. The mother wolf did not bare her teeth or try to flee. Instead, she focused on Dorothy's hands, her eyes wary but not threatening. Dorothy set the bowl down and retreated, watching as the wolf sniffed at the water, her pups crowding behind her. The old woman, trembling from both cold and nerves, watched as the wolf dipped her muzzle, cautiously, as if expecting trickery. Dorothy's efforts at care were primitive, but the intention was clear. For the first time, Dorothy stayed on the porch for hours, quietly reading while the wolf, exhausted, slept in the snow. Periodically, Dorothy tried to inch closer, offering bits of cloth, her intentions measured. Throughout the day, Dorothy reflected on her losses. Both sons had died young, one from sickness, one from a fall in the woods. The pain, slow and persistent, had shaped her into what she was now. Solitary, wary, fiercely protective. Watching the wolf, Dorothy recognized echoes of her own despair. Maternal sacrifice, she thought, was a language spoken without words. As dusk crept over the land, Dorothy watched the pups nuzzle at their mother's wound. The wolf limped, exhausted, yet kept her body curled protectively around the young. Dorothy, shivering in the cold, promised herself she would not let them die without help. She returned inside for the night, feeling a strange bond forming, a delicate, unseen thread tying her fate to theirs. Dorothy began each morning with an established ritual: prepare a small offering of food for the wolves, refill their water, then sit on the porch wrapped in layers, observing. The pups, initially skittish, gradually began to trust her presence. Their mother watched every move with unwavering attention. Dorothy learned the wolves' signals. A low whine meant hunger, an arched back meant unease. She wrote her observations in the journal she kept beside the kitchen stove, noting changes in behavior and small milestones of trust. Dorothy established a feeding schedule. By late week, the wolves would wait just beyond the porch for their food, the pups sometimes edging closer if she sat very still. Dorothy noticed one pup, the smallest, lag behind, its energy lower than its siblings. Dorothy moved quietly, minimizing her own presence, attempting to read the small family's needs. Each evening, she read books about wolves she had found in the local library years ago, trying to understand how to care for wild young. One afternoon, Dorothy's phone rang. The shrill signal broke her concentration. Her nephew, calling from Denver, checked if she was warm, had enough groceries, and asked about her health. Dorothy skirted the truth about the wolf family, simply mentioning strange animals hiding in the woods. Her nephew dismissed her worries, urging her to stay indoors. After the call, Dorothy went back outside, watching the wolves. The mother's wound had worsened. Dorothy considered calling a veterinarian, but feared it would bring more attention than help. Each night, Dorothy debated her next move. The moral dilemma gnawed at her. How much could she do before meddling with the natural balance? She knew the wolves could not survive alone, but feared both the wild and human threats. For now, Dorothy chose caution, focusing on caretaking, learning from signals and routines. She reminded herself not to speak, just observe, and keep the fragile peace. The secret could not last. One morning, Dorothy found two neighbors in her driveway, suspicious, animated, and worried. They had seen prints in the snow, evidence of predators too near to comfort. Dorothy kept words to a minimum, hoping to diffuse alarm, but rumors had spread. The town felt threatened by the prospect of wolves nesting at the edge of the settlement. Dorothy's quiet resolve hardened. She defended her right to help the animals, explaining their desperation and weakness. The community pressured her for action. Some neighbors visited daily, demanding updates, and warning Dorothy about dangerous wildlife. She listened without arguing, unwilling to betray her guests. By week's end, the town's hunter, Tom Jenkins, arrived, a broad-shouldered man with a rifle across his back. He made his position clear, suggesting the only solution was removal. Dorothy did not waver. She protected the wolves, keeping their shelter disguised and refusing entry to her property. Each day, she felt the tension in the air, an uneasy balance between her desire to help and the fear that clung to the town. The wolves sensed the change as well. Their mother grew more anxious, the pups even more wary of strangers. Dorothy's sense of responsibility deepened. She memorized routines, checked for threats, and made sure food was placed at night, away from prying eyes. Each act of care was a private rebellion against worry and pressure, a pledge not to abandon the creatures who had become part of her life. She marked each step in her journal, understanding that every day was a battle for trust, survival, and dignity. The first hint of serious trouble came on a Monday. Dorothy noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked discreetly past the bend in the road. Its badge revealed the presence of wildlife authorities. She watched through the frost-blurred glass as two officers, faces hidden beneath hoods and sunglasses, walked toward her home with slow deliberation. When they knocked, Dorothy opened the door, hands folded and voice firm. Their intent was clear. They had received complaints about large predators, and protocol demanded a search. Bruno barked at the officer's feet, but Dorothy kept her composure. She answered their questions, explaining that she'd noticed wolves in the area but hadn't seen them recently. The officers cited regulations, making vague threats about relocation and public safety. Dorothy, resolute, assured them that her property was secure and her animals safe. The men left reluctantly, jotting notes and promising further investigation. Once the truck disappeared down the road, Dorothy rushed to the porch. The wolf family had retreated behind the shed, their breaths steaming in the cold air. Dorothy's heart thudded, a mix of relief and fear. She prepared to hide the wolves more carefully, clearing a storage space in an empty corner beneath her house, scattering straw and cardboard to keep the area warm and out of sight. Her deception required constant vigilance. Every day brought the possibility of surprise checks. Dorothy monitored the woods, making sure the wolves' tracks overlapped with those of local wildlife. She rationed food and water, placing offerings deeper in the woods, then guiding the wolves silently with carefully timed signals. The pups followed their mother with hesitant steps, trusting Dorothy's presence as much as their own instincts. The winter grew harsher. Dorothy felt the strain, her own body protesting with every trip outside, nerves heightened by the constant risk. Though she despised lying, she knew it was necessary. The authorities' rules were inflexible, and any hint of wild animals dwelling this close would mean forced separation and pain for the fragile family. Dorothy's transformation was plain. She became proactive, hiding evidence and forging new routines, casting herself as a shield between bureaucracy and the creatures whose fate now rested in her hands. In the quiet hours, Dorothy wrote in her journal, documenting each subterfuge and the new courage she'd discovered. She no longer saw herself as an old woman on the edge of the woods, but as an advocate, someone whose resolve had grown with each threat she faced. Each act of deception, each refusal to compromise, drew her closer to the wolves, weaving their struggle together in a single narrative of survival. Midwinter arrived with a storm that battered Dorothy's house, rattling the windows and burying the landscape beneath drifts of snow. Inside, she watched the wolf mother's decline accelerate. Her breathing grew shallower, her wound not healing despite Dorothy's efforts. The old woman understood that mere observation was no longer enough. The wolf needed real medical care. That night, Dorothy sat by the flickering firelight, weighing the risks. She reviewed her options, flipping through a battered phone book before hesitating over the number for a veterinarian in town. She dialed, her voice barely above a whisper. The vet, cautious and skeptical, eventually agreed to visit but insisted on secrecy. Dorothy prepared for the vet's arrival in meticulous detail. She moved the wolf family into the hidden shed, layering blankets and focusing on the mother's comfort. The pups, sensing the tension, became quiet and withdrawn. Dorothy, masked by urgency, arranged for the vet to arrive after dark. The town slept under icy wind as the vet's small sedan crept silently into the driveway. Once inside, the vet examined the wolf, his hands gentle but firm as he cleaned the wound and administered medicine. Dorothy watched, silent, her hands shaking not with cold but with dread. The vet worked quickly, then whispered instructions and left. Dorothy sat in the gloom, the air damp with steam and worry. The night stretched interminably. Dorothy checked the wolf often, sitting motionless beside her as the animal's breathing faded. The pups curled close, confused and alert. Dorothy felt the weight of each minute, the crushing realization that despite all efforts, the wolf mother would likely not survive. Her world, narrowed by the storm and circumstance, was haunted by the threat of loss. As dawn broke, the wolf's breaths became shallower, and Dorothy understood that the family's story would soon turn. By morning, silence reigned. Dorothy awoke to a world muted by snow, all sounds swallowed by its thick embrace. Her first steps took her directly to the shed, where she found the wolf mother huddled with her pups. Dorothy knelt close, reaching out in the slow, careful way she had practiced for weeks. The wolf lay still, her body warm only by the persistent closeness of her young. Over the next hours, Dorothy remained by the family, guiding the pups away for scraps of food, returning to check for signs of improvement. The wolf mother's eyes grew glassy, her movements minimal, a slow decline, witnessed and attended by the old woman who had anchored their fragile survival through winter's worst days. Toward evening, the vet returned, his presence marked by urgency. He checked the wound, tried another course of medicine, and waited in resigned silence as the wolf mother took her final breaths. The pups whined, gathering tightly to their fading parent. Dorothy, heart heavy but resolute, did what she could to comfort them. As night drifted in, the wolf mother slipped away, her life ending in quiet. Dorothy wrapped her in a blanket and buried her near the edge of the woods while the pups watched, their eyes wide with confusion and grief. Responsibility settled on Dorothy's shoulders. She was the only caretaker for the orphaned family now. Her resolve deepened as she returned inside, gathering resources, preparing to guide the wolves through a world both unfamiliar and threatening. Dorothy's compassion had exacted a price, hours of secrecy, strain, and loss. But she understood, with clarity, that this moment marked a new reality. The pups would not survive without guidance. As she marked the wolf's grave beside a tall fir tree, Dorothy made her own silent vow. Whatever effort was required, she would meet it, her life now bound completely to theirs. The cold pressed harder against the walls as winter deepened, and the absence of the wolf mother left a wound at the heart of Dorothy's home. The pups wandered the shed, searching each corner for the comfort they had lost. Dorothy watched, her movements deliberate and gentle. She understood old grief. It lingered like frost, difficult to thaw. Day after day, she woke before dawn to feed the pups, measuring out rations with the carefulness of someone entrusted with fragile lives. Dorothy jotted notes in her journal, copying advice from wildlife handbooks she found in the town library. Raising orphan wild animals was a trial of patience and stamina. She learned to mix formula that would sustain the pups, tried to mimic the routine their mother offered: eating, sleeping, play. Each effort cost her energy. No gesture felt adequate to replace what the pups had lost. Her own strength wore thin. The routines of housework, cooking, tending the fire, feeding Bruno, bled into the new routines of care. Some nights, she woke to the sound of the pups whining. She would move quietly to the shed, pressing a gentle hand against their tiny shoulders. The world outside was relentless, cold, and unforgiving. Though Dorothy felt exhaustion gathering in her bones, she refused to neglect her promise. Pressure from the town grew. Neighbors dropped by often, their visits brisk and their advice insistent. They warned Dorothy about the risks, disease, aggression, the legality of keeping wild animals so close to town. Dorothy listened, nodding and thanking them, but never relenting. Her determination became a quiet rebellion. She ignored ultimatums and worked harder to keep the pups hidden. The harsh weather forced Dorothy to improvise. She layered old blankets in the shed, sealed up drafts, and built barriers against the wind. Bruno, sensing sadness, curled near the pups when Dorothy allowed it. Their small, furry bodies grew leaner, eyes wide and watchful. Weeks passed, and Dorothy watched them searching for the warmth and guidance their mother could no longer supply. As days blurred into one another, Dorothy's own health began to waver. She spent hours reading, studying veterinary guides, calling for advice from out-of-town experts. Sleep came in snatches. Her hands grew stiff with cold and work. Yet, through every setback, Dorothy persisted. She made a promise not only to the pups, but to herself, not to surrender, no matter how heavy the cost. Winter remained unyielding, burying the landscape under layers of white. The town's patience thinned, and pressure from authorities escalated. Dorothy received a formal letter taped to her door, sharp, official, and final. The Animal Control Department had decided the wolf pups must be surrendered to a local zoo or else euthanized. The tone was harsh, leaving no room for negotiation. Dorothy read the letter beneath the porch light, hands trembling. Inside, Dorothy paced the kitchen, rereading the letter, feeling the ultimatum squeeze her resolve to the core. She prepared arguments, wrote letters to officials, explained the vulnerability of the orphans and the cruelty of removing them from the only guardian they knew. Each attempt was met with bureaucratic indifference. The law was clear, her options limited. Dorothy agonized over the future of the pups. Captivity would not offer them life, only a slow separation from everything they instinctively knew. But the wild offered little hope either. Without their mother's protection, survival was unlikely. Dorothy weighed the possibility of release, studying the habits of the wolves in the surrounding forest. She drove out in her old truck some afternoons, searching for tracks, looking for signs of a resident pack. In moments alone, Dorothy questioned her own resolve. She knew the risks: a life spent outside society's boundaries, a fate she'd endured since her own children left home and the years shadowed her days with silence. Still, the thought of handing the pups over to strangers, watching them fade in captivity, was unthinkable. Her journal filled with questions, potential solutions, desperate hopes. Dorothy experimented with feeding schedules, enrichment, anything that might ready the pups for what might come. She trembled under the weight of her decision, battling between reason and heart. The finality of the town's demand pressed close, suffocating. In the deep night, Dorothy moved between the shed and her bedroom, checking on the pups, whispering encouragement, and preparing for the only path she could justify, finding a place for them among their kind, beyond the reach of human law. The time for debate expired. Dorothy folded the official letter and placed it in her journal, marking the day with resignation. She would not send the pups to a cage, nor would she allow their lives to be ended before they'd had a chance to grow. Her resolve became unyielding in the light of day. She spent hours studying local maps, searching for terrain that matched wolf territory. Old library books provided clues, and she copied information on migration routes and denning areas. Dorothy built a plan, gathering supplies for a journey into the forest: blankets, food, a sturdy walking stick, and water. She prepared herself, knowing she would leave her house behind, perhaps for the last time. On the morning of departure, Dorothy walked through her home, touching each familiar object with reverence. The photographs on the mantel, the worn rug beneath her feet, the chilly air in each room. Bruno wagged his tail, uncertain. The wolf pups, sensing change, watched Dorothy's every move. Dorothy loaded the pups into an old crate lined with blankets. She carried them carefully to her truck, pausing a moment to look back at the house that had sheltered so many memories and griefs. She understood that the journey ahead held unknown dangers. Her age, the cold, the threat of failure, all pressed close. But determination led her forward. Dorothy drove until the road became impassable, then continued on foot, the crate heavy in her hands. She followed animal trails, scanning for any sign of wolf packs. Each step carried her deeper into the wilderness, the world growing wilder, quieter, farther from town and its judgments. At intervals, Dorothy stopped, setting the pups down, feeding them, whispering comfort. The woods seemed endless, trees swaying in the wind, the snow crunching beneath her boots. She rested by fallen logs, measured the journey by sunlight and exhaustion. She watched for wolf tracks, howled softly in hopes of drawing a response from the pack. As the day faded and Dorothy made camp beneath a tall pine, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She knew she was risking everything, not just the pups, but her own life, her every remaining certainty. She drifted into sleep beside the crate, aware that the journey might end at any moment, and the fate of the orphans lay with the wild. Dorothy rose at dawn, her body aching from sleep interrupted by cold and anxiety. The forest surrounded her, vast and silent under a pale sky. She opened the crate, letting the wolf pups press close to her for a moment of comfort before she bundled them again for travel. She moved slowly, careful not to exhaust herself in the sharp air. The snow was heavy at first, old drifts masking hollows and animal paths, but as morning passed, Dorothy found traces, a single paw print, a flattened patch where a larger animal had rested. The journey into the heart of the wilderness was relentless. Dorothy marked her progress by the rhythm of her steps, the change from one stand of pine to another, the absence of roads and fences. She rationed food, stopping every hour to feed the pups and herself. She watched them closely, seeing how they responded to new scents and sounds. The smallest pup lagged behind, and Dorothy tucked it into her coat each time the others wandered too far. Despite exhaustion, Dorothy pressed deeper. She relied on her notes, scraps of advice gleaned from books and old guides. The land grew steeper, the forest denser. She remembered her sons, the walks they used to take in these woods, the time she had feared losing them in weather like this. Now, she retraced their old routes, sensing they watched over her. The pups began to show signs of hope. The change in their behavior was small at first. They sniffed new air, listened to distant calls. The mountains loomed closer, and Dorothy guessed she was near the far boundary, where old packs made their dens in hidden hollows and tangled brush. She studied every sign, walking with greater caution as she approached places marked by animal passage. Hair stuck to branches, bones half buried in snow. Midway through the afternoon, Dorothy encountered a set of fresh tracks, larger than those the pups had made, clear and purposeful. She paused, wary, and watched the pups. Their ears were up, their bodies tense. Dorothy rested at the base of an ancient spruce tree, offering water and comfort, preparing herself for what might come next. She set up a small camp, collecting wood for a fire, wrapping herself and the pups in every available blanket as night approached. The day had tested Dorothy's limits. Her hands ached, her limbs were slow, her thoughts skipping between hope and doubt. The pups settled against her, anxious but trusting, sensing she was their refuge against the wild. As dusk fell, Dorothy heard rustlings in the far trees. Uncertain, familiar, neither threat nor certainty. She held the pups close and waited for the forest to decide what happened next. Dorothy woke to scattered tracks circling her camp. She moved carefully, setting the pups loose beneath her watchful gaze. The air was crisp and thin, every noise echoing sharply between the trees. Dorothy felt the nearness of others, no longer alone in the wild, the faint sense of being watched by something hidden but present. She waited, observing as the pups explored the brush nearby. Their curiosity lifted their spirits. They yipped and played, struggling against the uncertainty of the unfamiliar woods. Dorothy traced a path in the fresh snow away from camp, looking for signs of the pack she hoped to find. She left scraps of food at intervals, marking places she hoped the wolves might approach. Mid-morning, Dorothy saw movement in the shadows beyond the clearing. A large wolf, its coat thick and gray, studied her from a distance, nostrils flaring at the scent of the pups. The animal kept its distance, circling but never approaching. Dorothy knelt by the pups, steadying their nerves, whispering comfort even though she knew they could not fully understand. Hours passed in tense quiet, the wolves shifting closer with the falling sun. Dorothy tried not to intrude, making herself small and harmless, letting the pups venture closer with each passing minute. The pack's presence was undeniable. A pair of adults, cautious but curious, their movements orchestrated by experience and survival. Dorothy understood what was needed. She guided the pups toward the edge of the clearing, then sat back, motionless, watching the interaction unfold. The pups sensed the presence of their kin, remained still, hesitant to approach. Dorothy remembered raising her own children, the moment when letting go was the only choice left, allowing them the freedom to find their way. The wolves tested the pups, sniffing and nudging, deciding whether to accept the newcomers. Dorothy, witnessing the process, felt the weight of every decision she had made. She wanted to intervene, but she knew her role was over. Her final act was to step aside. As night fell, Dorothy whispered final words to the pups, not expecting they would understand. She remained at the edge of the clearing, heart pounding as the adult wolves led the pups deeper into the darkness. Dorothy felt loss and relief, knowing she had given the orphans their best chance. She stayed by the cold campfire, tracking every movement, every lesson in sacrifice and letting go. The last hours stretched in silence beneath a sky heavy with stars. Dorothy knew she would not return home. The effort had left her drained, every bone aching with weariness and isolation. She remained at the edge of the clearing, watching the wolf pack from a distance, listening to calls and whispers not meant for her ears. The connection between Dorothy and the pups lingered even as they adjusted to their new world. The adults guided them through the brush, teaching, protecting, integrating. Dorothy sensed that her sacrifice had made a difference, that the bond she had formed could not be undone even by the passage of time or distance. As her strength faded, Dorothy kept her journal within reach, scribbling last notes for whoever might find them. She thought of her sons, her life's regrets, and the strange way compassion could remake the stories of the living. She drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes feeling Bruno's warmth at her side, always hearing the sounds of the forest and its inhabitants. Weeks later, searchers from the town found traces of Dorothy's final campsite, a scattering of blankets, the journal, remnants of the journey. They pieced together her path, found evidence of the wolves' acceptance, and marked the boundary where the old woman made her last stand. News traveled slowly through the town. People spoke in quiet awe about the magnitude of Dorothy's sacrifice, the risk she had taken, the empathy that had driven her beyond rules and comfort. The wolf pups survived. With time, they grew into strong predators, adapted to the pack, learning the ways of the wild. Still, the stories persisted. How they watched from the edge of the forest, how they lingered near the settlement now and then, as if remembering. The connection was impossible to explain, but everyone who knew Dorothy understood. Her final act had altered the boundary between wildness and kindness, between life and loss. The tale ended as winter melted into spring. The wilderness left unchanged except for those who carried the memory. For the wolves, for Dorothy, and for the small town at the forest's edge, something irrevocable had been given, a devotion that survived through seasons of hardship and hope.